Stay away.
You were the witch. You fucking witch.
I can hear his smile.
I am become death.
Tales Under a Broken Sky, Episode 37, The Changeling. I had a brother once, you know. He's dead. Been gone a long time. Only, I didn't know until a few weeks ago. We weren't close at all the last time I saw him. We were for a while as children. He was my twin after all, and I think, all things considered, that there is some sort of connection there. Between twins, that is. At least, there used to be anyway. When we were children, I remember we always shared an understanding, a mutual empathy that existed independent of words. But that's a thing of the past now. Has been for a long time. Something happened around our 7th birthday. That's a good while ago now. And at that age, our parents weren't much for sharing grown-up things with us. I think that's when his tantrums began. We were kids, and all kids have their bad days. But I know that when Sean started acting up, it became a matter of concern with my parents. Best I can tell, the change started with an illness, a brief, ugly thing that went away as suddenly as it started. It left my brother with deep bags under his eyes that never completely went away, and a thin, gaunt look that lingered despite the ferocious appetite he developed afterwards. He had always been a quiet lad, but after he fell sick, waking one morning to a burning fever and uncontrollable tremors, his demeanour changed. He was all of a sudden loud and brash, prone to outbursts of anger and aggression. I know at one point, our parents suspected him of harming our family dog, but the remains were never found, so they couldn't prove anything one way or another. There were days when he almost seemed his old self again. We would play football or hurling, go down to the beach and skim rocks. But even on the best of those days, he always seemed distant, aloof in a way that I could never quite put my finger on. I would catch him staring at me, an odd look, like he was trying to figure out a puzzle or piece something together. But when he saw me, he would laugh it off and continue as if nothing had happened. But for the most part, he kept to himself, and it seemed like most of the people around him were happy to leave it at that. In school, he gained a reputation for having a mean wit, and if you became the object of his attention, his cutting jibes prodded at the most self-conscious and insecure parts of you. It was as if he had unfettered access to your innermost thoughts and fears. He just seemed to know exactly where and how to cut to leave you most unbalanced. The other kids avoided him like the plague, but he never seemed to mind. While they were off playing games and sports during break times, he would wander off by himself, seemingly oblivious to their nervous glances. He seemed to take satisfaction from towing that line, pushing just enough to leave those around him unsettled, but never enough to cause undue hassle or draw scrutiny from the teachers. And that was the thing, you see. Strange things used to happen around him. Personal possessions would go missing or break, but nothing could ever be traced back to him. People had their suspicions, but never any proof to back them up. When questioned, he would never hesitate to turn out his pockets or empty his bag. Nothing was ever found, but it seemed like he took a vicious delight in proving people wrong and making them feel bad for it. And in many cases, it looked, at least to me, like he actively courted those conversations. But that was my brother for you, always skirting the edges of the spotlight, showing up just enough to be seen and have an impact, but never enough to draw too much attention. In public, at least. At home was a different story. He knew every one of my parents' buttons, and he pressed them at every opportunity. To the outside world, everything was fine. He was studious, if a bit quiet, polite, even if it felt passive-aggressive, and never caused any trouble. At home, he was a nightmare. There were tantrums, broken furniture and decor, and that missing dog, but that was mostly when he was younger. The real problem started as he got older. Things that could never be penned to him, but were clearly designed to hurt and wound. There was a sizable credit card bill run up in my mother's name. Used women's underwear, not belonging to my mother, found tangled in the bedsheets. The little baggie of cocaine in my father's suitcase that derailed an entire family holiday. And unprofessional and inappropriate messages and emails sent to my parents' colleagues and bosses. But never, not once in the 11 years between the change and when I last saw him, was there any evidence ever linking him to these activities. My parents tried to find it in some hope that they could help him. They told me this later after he left and dropped off the radar, but they never once found the thing. I do know that the strain of what was happening took its toll. My father was grey and balding before his 50s, and he passed away early, his heart giving out shortly after his 52nd birthday. The situation with my brother affected my mom more physically, and she went from a bright, vibrant, athletic woman who trained for marathons to being almost entirely bedbound by her 60th birthday. It was a slower decline with her, starting after my father died, and progressing steadily until she passed last month. She just withered away, really. It wasn't any disease, at least nothing the doctors could find, but whatever it was, killed her as sure as any cancer. It was only on her deathbed that she confessed to me what had really happened to my brother. My mum had always been a religious woman, although the strain in our house had tempered that devotion over time. But in her final days, she showed me the diary she had been keeping, harking back to the early days after my brother's illness. She had become utterly convinced that her son, my brother, had been taken and replaced with a changeling as a child. She had reams of cutouts and clippings of folklore, news stories, and old diaries. Her own journal laid out a vast conspiracy linking disappearances, erratic behaviour, and family tragedies going back years, long before we were born. I struggled to believe her thinking. Throughout everything that had happened, my mother was always collected, if not always calm. She was my rock for years, through breakups, financial difficulties, and health problems. All of it seemed so unlike her. But in her final years, she had struggled immensely with the loss of my father and her concerns and worries over my long-lost brother. It was easy to see the pseudo-logical rationalizations of a conspiracy theorist in her neat web of random, unexplained disappearances and tragedies. Never, in my entire life, would I have ever believed such talk from my mother. Never mind it going back as far as my childhood. But there it was in front of me, semi-coherent ramblings penned in her neat, tidy hand, talking about events from my childhood in a way that made my blood run cold. She blamed everything that had happened on him. My father's death, the troubles in their marriage, even the long-running feud with the neighbours over their missing cats. At first, the diary read like I imagine most would, a place to share worries, fears and concerns, to work through thoughts and emotions. But as it progressed, it became something more than that. It became the chronicle of her descent into madness. Somewhere along the way, she had become convinced that my brother was not her son, that he had been taken, that the thing left in its place was not human. She obsessed over it, the journal keeping a detailed account of how she followed him, spied on him, and tried to catch him in the act of one of the many misfortunes she blamed on him. Her madness convinced her that the lack of evidence, that her failure to catch him, was further proof that he was no longer her son. For what it's worth, my father doesn't seem to have ever agreed with her. She detailed her many fights over my brother, chastised his stubborn refusal to buy into her belief that my brother was no longer my brother. When we were 17, a local girl disappeared. It was all over the news at the time. My mother became convinced that my brother was behind it. I didn't know this at the time. Our only conversation on the subject extended only as far as a brief inquiry as to whether I knew her, and a sad shake of her head as she expressed what a tragedy it was and how much her parents must be suffering. 6 months after that, my brother left. Or at least, I thought he did. He was there one day, and the next he was gone. A few personal items from his room missing, along with his worn backpack from school. Father was distraught, and I believed at the time that my mother was too. She grew short and irritable. I would hear her pacing downstairs at all hours of the night, the quiet arguing as my father tried to get her to go back to bed. It settled over time, my dad slipping into the steady plod that characterized the rest of his days. My mom going about her day like nothing had happened. The guards were called, of course. Reports and statements filed. There were a few search parties organised, but they turned up nothing. Eventually, my mom's credit card, which he had presumably taken, was used in the city, and the guards ruled him a runaway. But he was 18 then, and they seemed to wash their hands on it, for all intents and purposes. But that wasn't the whole truth, not even part of it, as hard as that is to admit now. I still can't believe it. Not of my mother. Not of the kind, gentle lady who stood by me, who grieved my father, and whose head jerked around every time someone vaguely resembling my brother came into view. The last coherent entries in her diary describe in clinical detail how she killed her son, my brother, and disposed of his body. I guess she had confronted him when the girl disappeared, more than on one occasion, from what I can tell. Although I am unsure as to how much of a grasp of time she retained during that period. The last time they had argued, she had confronted him as he was leaving the house, and this is the only part of the accepted story that rings true. He had packed his most precious belongings in his bag and was leaving for good, finally tired of the scrutiny and mistrust being levelled at him by his mother. Her journal describes how she had struck him, how he had been knocked unconscious, and how, in what would become the peak of her obsession, decided to exorcise the malevolent creature that had taken the place of her baby. She had taken him out back to the old barn and begun her mania-fueled attempt at reclaiming her son. In line with the folklore that my mother had become so desperately invested in, she had burned my brother with a hot poker, scalded him with pans of boiling water, and eventually built a searing bonfire, tying him to one of the barn supports, inches from the flames. I don't know what she expected, but his death came fast. I don't know whether from the heat or the smoke, or a combination of all his injuries. That part didn't matter to her, and she didn't go into detail. All she wanted was for the she to return her child. Her diary told me that his death came fast, and that he barely uttered a whimper. In her mind, at least, the creature that she was torturing just stared at her with cold detachment and barely restrained malevolence. She buried him beneath the fairy tree that grew in the field behind the barn, no mean feat with the cold winter earth, and hid the turned earth with the fallen leaves and branches she had carefully cleared from the spot. And then she waited. Days, weeks, and finally months, for the she to return her beautiful boy to her. But he never came. She says my father never knew, that he believed until his deathbed that his son had run away. I don't know if I quite believe that though. My father never talked about my brother as if he was still alive, and I'm sure that's what drove him to his early grave. He always stuck by my mother though, even though I could see how much it cost him. I guess I'll never know his truth in the matter. Those secrets were buried with him long ago. And now you know. I'm going to the guards later. See about exhuming his body. I don't have it in me to do that myself. I guess some part of me is too afraid of what I might find. Or maybe it's what I might not find that worries me the most. Welcome, folks, to episode 37 of Tales Under a Broken Sky. I am your host, Keith, and I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. This week, I wanted to do something a bit different, returning to the Tales by the Hearth series, and delving into some more Irish folklore-inspired horror. This time around, we look at the myth of changelings, traditionally believed to be old or infirm fairies left in place of a newborn or young child. As is the case in many cultures, especially before the development of modern medicine and diagnostics. This is one of those traditions that seems to have grown up around the culture's attempt to deal with what is different, or to process grief, especially at a time when mortality rates in general were high, especially infant and child mortality. Nowadays, it is believed that the concept of the changeling emerged as a way to understand neurodivergence, intellectual disabilities and development issues, and sudden infant mortality, transferring perceived unusual behaviour into the doings of a supernatural force. The tragedy of this is that, while the tales spoke of changelings being mischievous and troublemaking, and causing significant problems for the families that unwittingly played host to them, the majority of the violence in these tales is actually linked to the other side, and the attempts of desperate families to force the she, or fairies, to return their lost child. This involved exposure to heat and cold, or deprivation to one extent or another. In this case, it appears that the real monsters were not the supernatural forces believed to be at work, but the beliefs and attitudes of the families involved. This folklore has examples as recent as 1895, and the infamous case of Bridget Cleary, who, after developing a case of bronchitis, her husband came to believe that she had been replaced, and this resulted in her murder during his attempts to bring his wife back. I've always felt that so many of our superstitions are grounded in these fears and concerns, and a lack of understanding of that which is different or unexplained. In this particular case, changelings were used as a vehicle for understanding developmental issues, as well as infant sickness and death, where, in the absence of modern diagnostic medicine, there was no way to explain, cope, or process these situations. In the end, this is really a reflection of the very human fear of the unknown or the unexplained. All of our greatest fears come from things that we don't understand, or that we lack the knowledge or requisite understanding to explain. And the really chilling idea is that despite all of our advances in medicine, hygiene, diagnostics, and the understanding of the human mind, that these superstitions and beliefs persist in their own way to this present day, informing intolerance, prejudice, and indeed continued violence against groups that don't meet social constructs and norms first created in a very different time to the one that we now live in. But that's it for this week, folks. The next episode will be another standalone story before I dive back into some of the serial content again. I'm getting really excited to continue the stories started in The Old Gods Are Dying, Pretender, The Possessed, and The Witches Have Killed Anew. It has been far too long since I revisited these words and stories, and I'm looking forward to sharing them with you again soon. Until next time. Before you go, thank you for spending this time with me by the hearth. If you enjoyed tonight's story, it helps more than you might think to follow the show, leave a rating, or share an episode with someone who loves quiet horror and dark fantasy. Independent creators live and die by word of mouth, and every small act of support keeps Tales Under a Broken Sky alive. And if you'd like to explore more of my dark fiction beyond the audio, you can find Tales Under a Broken Sky, Collected Stories, Volume 1 on Amazon, a short story anthology featuring all of my original short stories from Season 1 of the podcast. Thank you truly for listening, for walking the dark with me, and for supporting independent storytelling. Until next time.